The first image is not a ship, it is a paper. In the trial of Captain William Kidd, that paper was supposed to prove whether the prize that made him infamous was piracy or a lawful capture in wartime. Kidd said the paper existed. The court said it was not there. Long after Kidd's death, printed copies and archival references to the same French passes surfaced in the state papers. Dalton's 1911 publication drew them from House of Commons records and Admiralty correspondence that had survived for 2 centuries. The trial said piracy. The missing papers said politics. Both survived. The question is not whether Kidd was innocent of everything he was accused of. The question is narrower, colder, and more useful. What happens when a man is tried for piracy while the papers that could answer the piracy charge are kept outside the room? The room was the Old Bailey in London. The dates were 8 and 9 May 1701. The charge list was heavy: murder and 5 separate piracy indictments. The sentence came quickly. On 23 May 1701, Kidd was taken to execution dock at Wapping and hanged. But this case does not begin at Wapping. It begins in the paperwork that made Kidd possible. In 1695, Kidd was not hired as an outlaw. He was hired through power. Richard Coote, Earl of Bellamont, became the visible patron. Behind him were men with heavier offices: John Somers, the Lord Chancellor; Edward Russell, Earl of Orford, connected to the Admiralty; Henry Sidney, Earl of Romney, and other investors whose names made the voyage more than a merchant gamble. The plan looked clean on paper. Kidd would command the adventure galley. He would apprehend named pirates and others who preyed on English trade. He would also carry authority to take French ships, because England and France were at war. The profits, if there were profits, would be divided among the king, the backers, Kidd, and the crew. That last sentence is the first warning. The expedition was a law enforcement mission with a prize-sharing engine inside it. It asked a private captain to police piracy and to make money doing it. The legal paper and the financial hunger were loaded onto the same deck. Kidd sailed from England, recruited in New York, and crossed toward the Indian Ocean. The route mattered. The richest traffic was not in the Caribbean. It was in the lanes between Surat, the Red Sea, Mocha, and the Malabar coast, where Mughal, Armenian, Indian, English, Dutch, and French interests overlapped. The sea did not sort ships by the neat categories written in London. A vessel might be Indian-owned, Armenian-managed, English-commanded, and carrying a French pass. That mixed world is what the case turns on. Kidd's commission depended on clean categories. The Indian Ocean did not supply them. For months, the voyage produced almost nothing. The crew had expected prizes. Instead, they got heat, delay, disease, and discipline. At one point, Kidd struck his gunner, William Moore, with a bucket bound with iron hoops. Moore died the next day. That death became the murder charge. It mattered because it was the charge that could send Kidd to the gallows, even if the piracy case became difficult. And the French passes, however the court ruled on them, could never answer for Moore. Then Kidd found the prize that changed everything. In early 1698, off the Malabar coast, the adventure galley came upon the Quetta merchant, also rendered in the papers as the Kara or Kerry merchant. It was a large vessel returning from Bengal toward Surat. Its people and cargo belonged to a world that the London indictment would later compress into a few legal words. The ship had Armenian interests, Indian crew, an English captain named Wright, and a French connection through papers of safe conduct. Kidd approached under French colors. That was a wartime deception, and the record does not make it look noble. But deception by itself is not the legal question. The legal question was whether the ship carried French papers and whether those papers made her a lawful prize under Kidd's commission. Kidd's own narrative says a Frenchman from the ship came aboard and delivered the French pass. Later evidence says the captured prizes had French passes. The House of Commons papers record copies of those passes. Dalton's 1911 publication, titled "The Real Captain Kidd of Vindication," and honest in its title about its advocate's position, printed the passes and described them as papers that had been sent through Bellamont and the Admiralty. The episode does not rest on Dalton's argument alone. It rests on the documents Dalton brought into print, the trial transcript, and the parliamentary record that handled the same papers in 1701. At the trial, Kidd asked for them. again and again. Before the piracy trial could properly begin, Kidd tried to delay proceedings. He said he needed his papers. He said he had French passes. He said they had been taken from him by Bellamont. His counsel argued that if the ships had French passes when seized, the capture could be lawful. The judge asked the obvious question, where were the passes? They were not produced. That absence is the pivot of the episode. Up to this point, the surface question is whether Kidd took the Quetta merchant illegally. After this point, the larger question is why the court proceeded as if the absence of the documents was Kidd's failure, when the parliamentary record shows the same documents had moved through official hands. This is where Kidd's backers re-enter the room, even though they are not standing beside him. Bellamont had a direct problem. He had helped send Kidd out, then arrested him in Boston when the voyage became a scandal. If Kidd was a lawful privateer trapped by mutiny, bad timing, and disputed prize law, Bellamont had betrayed a man he had helped commission. If Kidd was a pirate, Bellamont became the governor who captured him. Summers had a different problem. He was already a target in Parliament. The Kidd venture was useful to his enemies because it tied a great officer of state to a voyage that now looked like an embarrassment, perhaps worse. If the case became a trial of who had authorized what and who expected profit, it could climb above Kidd. Orford and Romney had their own exposure. They were not anonymous spectators. Their names belonged to the circle of powerful men whose connection to the enterprise made Kidd's trial politically dangerous. Every document that helped Kidd explain the voyage also risked explaining the men behind it. This is the case's central mechanism. A pirate could be hanged. A commission could not be hanged. A set of noble investors could not be put in chains at Wapping without turning a criminal trial into a political crisis. So the trial had every reason to stay small. The court first tried Kidd for the killing of William Moore. That mattered because the French passes could not answer a murder charge. The indictment described a blow with a wooden bucket bound with iron hoops. The trial asked whether Moore died from that blow and whether the killing was murder. Kidd did not deny the blow. He said it was done in passion. The record includes dispute over Moore's health and the crew's disorder, but the jury convicted him. Once that happened, the piracy trials were no longer the only path to death. Kidd was already condemned. Even a successful French pass defense would not have erased that verdict. Kidd could win on piracy and still hang for murder. Then the court returned to piracy. Here the missing passes mattered directly. The Quetta merchant charge turned on whether the ship and goods belonged to friends of the English crown or whether the French pass brought the capture within Kidd's wartime authority. Kidd questioned Bradenham. He questioned Palmer. They said they had heard him speak of French passes, but they had not seen them. Kidd called Davis, who said Kidd had given passes to be read and that Captain Elms called them French passes. The judge summed up the absence. For the court, no pass had been proved. If no French pass was proved, the taking of a friendly ship was piracy. The legal logic was simple. The document gap made it simple, but the later paper trail makes the simplicity look constructed. Kidd had been asking for the documents that sat closest to the legal issue. The House of Commons had handled Kidd papers. Jameson's edition of Colonial Privateering documents notes that in April 1701, the Commons ordered papers Kidd desired for trial to be delivered to the Admiralty. Dalton printed copies of the French passes and argued that the officials had them when Kidd needed them. The careful phrasing matters. The surviving record does not let us watch one named official hide one named paper in one named drawer. The record does show a harder fact. Kidd asked for documents central to the piracy charge, and the trial proceeded without them, while official paper trails placed those documents in the machinery of government. That is not a treasure story. It is an evidence story. The most popular Kidd legend runs toward hidden wealth, maps, islands, and later romance. Johnson's 1724 history would later help fix Kidd in the pirate tradition, but Johnson is not needed for the core of this case. The trial transcript, the petitions, the Commons notes, and the French pass copies do the work. The legend asks where the money went. The case asks where the papers went. The trial record also shows Kidd's isolation. He was not a trained advocate. He had been imprisoned for a long time. His counsel came late and could not make the facts appear. He stood against witnesses whose lives could be shaped by cooperation with the Crown. That does not make every word Kidd said true. it does make the legal setting unequal. Kidd was not the only defendant. Other men from the voyage stood trial with him. Some were convicted, some were acquitted, some were later pardoned. But Kidd's name carried the political weight. The backers did not need every man to die. They needed the case to close in a way that did not reopen the commission. The cleanest reading I can take from the trial transcript is this. The men whose names sat above Kidd's voyage also needed the prosecution to look ordinary. No one had to stand in court and say openly that the passes should disappear. The machine could work through timing, custody, and procedure. Kidd could be told he had long notice. His request could be treated as delay. His counsel could be limited by the rules of the day. The prosecution could put forward witnesses who knew the ship had been taken, while the defense was left trying to prove the paper trail by memory. The case did not require a secret chamber. It required a file that did not arrive, a judge who treated non-arrival as non-existence, and a political world relieved when the distinction held. In that world, the French pass was more dangerous than a confession. A confession would have condemned Kidd alone. A pass asked why the government had sent a private man into a war zone with permission to seize French-connected ships, then punished him when a prize exposed the risks of that permission. The pass turned the charge outward. It made the case climb. That is why the episode keeps returning to paper. Paper authorized the voyage. Paper named the backers. Paper described the prize. Paper moved through Parliament. Paper failed to appear in court. And paper, much later, made Kidd's central defense impossible to dismiss as fantasy. After conviction, Kidd still tried to bargain with the state. On 12th of May, under condemnation, he wrote offering to direct the government to goods and value if his execution were delayed. This letter has often fed the wrong kind of fascination. In this episode, it matters for a different reason. Even after the verdict, Kidd was still trying to turn paperwork, property, and knowledge into survival. The government no longer needed him alive for that exchange. On 23rd May 1701, he was taken a whopping. The first rope failed. The second did not. His body was displayed as an admiralty warning to others at sea. A public execution can look like a final answer. In Kidd's case, it was also a way of ending a question. Once the body was at execution dock, the trial could be remembered as the fall of one pirate, not as the exposure of a venture built by powerful men who expected profit from the line between privateering and piracy. The aftermath proves how useful that narrowing was. Kidd's name became portable. It could move into ballads, pamphlets, fiction, and island stories. It could be made larger than the legal record. That is how a complicated admiralty case becomes a simple pirate name. Here is the author position I am willing to defend. I do not read the missing passes as a side issue. I read them as the case. The trial transcript records the question over and over. Did the papers exist, and where were they? The answer was available to the state in a way it was not available to Kidd. That does not acquit Kidd of every act. He struck more. He used deception at sea. He took ships in a world where commercial identity could be deliberately layered. He led a voyage that caused real losses to people far from London. An honest script should not turn him into a saint because his trial was compromised. But the question before the Old Bailey was not sainthood. It was legal guilt. On the piracy charges, the withheld paper problem sits exactly where the verdict needed proof. The cleanest version of the prosecution required a missing document. If the passes were absent, Kidd looked like a man inventing a defense. If the passes appeared, the trial had to face the uncomfortable fact that a royal and admiralty-backed privateering mission had produced the very act now being punished as piracy. That is why this case is not mainly about Kidd's character. It is about institutional convenience. The state could absorb a pirate. It could not easily absorb a public trial of its own mixed venture. Bellamont could say he had arrested the man. Somers could survive the parliamentary storm. Orford and Romney could recede into the category of backers rather than defendants in the public imagination. The East India Company and Armenian merchants could see the language of punishment applied to the seizure. The court could produce a verdict. Kidd could produce a body. The final irony is that the passes did what Kidd said they would do, but too late to save him. They did not erase every ambiguity. They did not prove clean conduct across the whole voyage. They did not answer the killing of Moore. But they did strike the exact point where the piracy verdict wanted certainty. The trial said there was no proof of the French pass. The later paper record says the proof had existed in official custody. Between those two sentences is the whole case. The record does not prove a single hidden hand. It proves something colder. The system had every incentive not to let the case grow upward. The trial was a piracy trial because a political trial would have named the wrong people. The missing passes were not an accident at the edge of the story. They were the edge that protected the men above him. The paper survived. Kidd did not.